When 18-year-old Natalie Martin left for a beach vacation with friends, she never imagined her high school boyfriend's obsession would be deadlier than the ocean. As graduation celebration turns to tragedy, a small town is forced to confront the brutal reality. Sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't a stranger, it's the one who claims to love you. Duncan Falls, Ohio, May 2023. The small riverside town with a population of just 880 seemed to collectively exhale as Philo High School released another graduating class into the world. Among them was 18-year-old Natalie Martin, a strikingly beautiful young woman with wavy chestnut hair and an infectious laugh that everyone remembered. Her graduation photos captured her vibrant spirit, head tilted back in genuine laughter, eyes alight with the promise of the future, the gold honor cords contrasting against her navy gown. Natalie spent her final days at Little Sprouts Daycare with mixed emotions. The children adored her, constantly seeking her attention with their artwork and stories. 3-year-old Emma followed her like a shadow, while Shy Jackson saved his rare smiles exclusively for Miss Natalie. She had a natural gift with them that the daycare director Susan often remarked couldn't be taught. Though accepted to Ohio University for environmental science in the fall, Natalie found herself lingering longer each day, memorizing the children's faces and storing away their innocent joy. Susan had seen many caregivers come and go, but few with Natalie's intuitive understanding of children. On Natalie's final Friday, Susan presented her with a scrapbook filled with tiny handprints and earnest crayon drawings. The gesture brought unexpected tears to Natalie's eyes, evidence of the connections she'd formed and the impact she'd made even at 18. Outside of work, Natalie's world centered on preparations for the much-anticipated senior trip to Myrtle Beach. She and 11 other graduates had spent months planning and saving for this week of freedom before their adult lives truly began. The beach house was booked, cars assigned, and expectations soaring. For Natalie, whose love of nature extended from the dense Ohio forests to the ocean she'd only visited once before, the trip represented not just celebration but exploration. Brooklyn Farrell, Natalie's best friend since elementary school, watched these preparations with a mixture of excitement and concern. With her straight blonde hair and carefully applied makeup, Brooklyn presented a more polished appearance than Natalie's natural beauty, but their differences had cemented their friendship rather than hindering it. Brooklyn had witnessed the entirety of Natalie's tumultuous relationship with Blake Linkis, from their starry-eyed beginning sophomore year to the troubling incident at Tyler Mitchell's Valentine's Day party just 3 months earlier. The Valentine's Day party had marked a turning point that many in their friend group tried to forget. What began as a typical teenage gathering, red solo cups, pounding music, couples pairing off in corners, ended with Natalie sprawled on the floor surrounded by shattered glass, blood beading along her forearm from where a picture frame had cut her. Blake standing over her, his wrestler's hands clenched into fists, his face contorted in an expression that frightened even his teammates. Only Tyler's intervention had prevented further escalation, and the next day Blake had appeared at Natalie's door with roses and tears, the first of many apologies that eventually wore down her resistance. Despite Natalie's insistence that they had broken up for good in April and were now just friends, Blake's persistent texts and coincidental appearances wherever Natalie happened to be told a different story. When Natalie and Brooklyn shopped for swimsuits at the Zanesville Mall, Blake texted asking for help choosing beach clothes. When Natalie mentioned getting coffee with her mother downtown, Blake appeared at the cafe as if by chance. Each encounter reinforced Brooklyn's worry about the week ahead in Myrtle Beach. Blake Linkis approached life with the same intensity he brought to the wrestling mat. At 6 feet tall with the solid build of a dedicated athlete, he commanded attention in every room. His dark hair, usually cropped short for wrestling season, had grown out slightly since graduation, softening his strong features but not the intensity in his eyes. As a star athlete at Philo High, Blake had enjoyed a certain status. Teachers overlooked missed assignments, classmates forgave his occasional outbursts, college scouts took notice despite his average grades. His father William, a former wrestler himself who had raised Blake alone since his mother left when Blake was 12, had watched his son's relationship with Natalie with growing concern over the past 2 years. After the February incident, William had insisted on anger management counseling, but Blake had attended only 4 sessions before making excuses about work and scheduling conflicts. The counselor had called William directly, expressing concern about Blake's resistance to discussing his relationship patterns and anger triggers. In his basement gym, Blake channeled his frustrations into physical exertion, pushing himself past exhaustion day after day. The weights provided the resistance he craved, the burn in his muscles a familiar comfort in a world that increasingly confused him. He spoke of the beach trip with casual enthusiasm to his father, insisting that things between him and Natalie were good now and they were going just as friends. The tightness in his jaw and the possessive gleam in his eyes when he mentioned her name suggested otherwise. 3 days before departure, the 12 travelers gathered at River's Edge Diner for a pre-trip meeting. The diner, with its 1950s decor and legendary milkshakes, had been their hangout spot throughout high school. Tyler Mitchell, the unofficial organizer with his easy smile and natural leadership abilities, confirmed the driving arrangements. 3 cars departing at 6 a.m. Sunday. Natalie would ride in Josh's minivan with Ryan Davidson and Ella, deliberately separate from Blake, who would travel in Tyler's SUV. Blake's barely concealed displeasure at this news rippled through the table like an electric current, though only Brooklyn and a few others noticed. Ryan Davidson, a transfer student who had become close to Natalie during a spring biology project, represented everything Blake wasn't: easygoing, thoughtful, and secure in himself. His sandy brown hair and relaxed demeanor gave him a California surfer vibe despite having moved from Cincinnati. His friendship with Natalie had been a particular source of tension in the final weeks of her relationship with Blake, though Natalie insisted they were just lab partners. Blake watched their interactions with calculating eyes, noting every laugh, every casual touch on the arm. The evening before departure found Natalie in her childhood bedroom, methodically packing her suitcase with new swimsuits, sundresses, and the practical items Brooklyn would inevitably forget. Her walls still held the evidence of her varied passions: environmental awareness posters next to pressed wildflowers and photographs of hunting trips with her father. Natalie's love of nature encompassed both preservation and practical knowledge of the outdoors, a contradiction that confused some but made perfect sense to her. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from the group chat, sharing last-minute reminders and escalating excitement. Blake's private messages came separately: casual questions about what she was bringing, what activities she wanted to do in Myrtle Beach, whether she was nervous about the long drive. Each message carried an undercurrent of expectation that Natalie found increasingly suffocating. She responded with brief, friendly texts, maintaining the delicate balance she'd struck since their breakup. Not close enough to encourage him, not distant enough to provoke his temper. As she placed her final items in the suitcase, Natalie paused at the framed photograph on her nightstand. The Philo High School wrestling team after their conference championship, Blake in the center with his arm possessively around her shoulders. She slipped the photo face down into a drawer, a small act of independence that felt significant in the moment. In his own bedroom across town, Blake stared at his phone, analyzing the tone and timing of Natalie's responses, searching for hidden meanings in her brief texts. The prospect of 7 days at the beach, watching her interact with their friends, particularly Ryan, filled him with a restless energy that even his punishing workout hadn't dispelled. He had plans for this trip, opportunities to remind Natalie of the connection they once shared, chances to win her back. He would be patient, strategic. After all, no one understood Natalie like he did. No one ever would. As Duncan Falls settled into darkness on that warm May night, 12 graduating seniors drifted to sleep with visions of ocean waves and newfound freedom. None could have predicted that for one of them, these would be her final nights on Earth, or that what began as a celebration of endings and beginnings would itself end in blood and tragedy on a South Carolina beach. The caravan departed Duncan Falls at dawn on June 4, 2023. 3 vehicles filled with graduation gifts, overpacked suitcases, and the boundless energy of 18-year-olds embarking on their first adventure without parental supervision. Fog clung to the Ohio River Valley as engines started and final hugs were exchanged with sleepy-eyed parents. Natalie settled into the backseat of Josh's minivan beside Ryan Davidson. As they pulled away from Miller's gas station, she caught Blake watching from Tyler's SUV, his expression carefully neutral despite the white-knuckled grip on his water bottle. This wasn't the first time she'd seen that look, a controlled mask hiding turbulent emotions. It had appeared when she danced with Drew at homecoming junior year, when she'd chosen to study with her chemistry group instead of watching his wrestling match, when she'd mentioned applying to colleges beyond Ohio. The 500-mile journey stretched before them like an open book. Ella controlled the music in Josh's minivan, filling it with indie rock and occasional throwbacks that had them all singing along. In the rearview mirror, Josh could see Natalie gradually relaxing, the tension she'd carried at departure melting away with each mile between them and Duncan Falls. 2 hours in, they stopped at a rest area in West Virginia. Blake made a beeline for Natalie, appearing at her side before she'd even closed the minivan door. "Made you coffee," he said, offering a paper cup. "Black with 1 sugar." The gesture transported Natalie back to their early dating days, sophomore year when Blake had memorized her coffee order, her class schedule, her favorite songs. How romantic it had seemed then, how suffocating it felt now. "Thanks," she replied, accepting the cup while maintaining careful distance. Blake's attention to detail had once been his most endearing quality. He remembered birthdays, anniversaries, preferences. For their 6-month milestone, he'd recreated their first date down to the exact booth at River's Edge Diner. The Valentine's Day before things soured, he'd covered her bedroom with her favorite wildflowers, trillium and bluebells he'd somehow found in February. But that same intensity had morphed into something heavier after a year together. His text messages increased from sweet check-ins to constant whereabouts inquiries. His thoughtfulness became possessiveness, showing up unannounced at her work, questioning her about male classmates, scrolling through her phone while she slept. The Valentine's Day party incident hadn't come from nowhere. It had been the culmination of a pattern, the breaking point after months of escalation. As the journey continued, the miles rolling beneath their wheels matched the waves of memory washing through Natalie. Blake in the bleachers at every volleyball game, even when they were hours away. Blake waiting in his car outside her house when she didn't answer texts fast enough. Blake's tearful apologies after jealous outbursts, always followed by periods of attentive devotion that made her question her own concerns. By late afternoon, their caravan crossed into South Carolina. The air thickened with humidity, palm trees began appearing along the highway, and excitement overtook reflection. When they finally reached the beach house in North Myrtle Beach, exhausted cheers erupted from all 3 vehicles. The rental exceeded their expectations, a spacious 2-story house with 4 bedrooms, a large common area, and a 2nd-floor balcony with glimpses of the ocean between neighboring buildings. After a chaotic rush to claim beds, the group raced to the beach, unable to resist the siren call of waves despite their travel fatigue. Only Blake remained behind, methodically unpacking, his actions deliberate as he placed his toiletries in the bathroom adjacent to where Natalie would be staying. From the 2nd-floor balcony, he watched her splash into the Atlantic with their friends, noted how she laughed when Ryan picked her up and spun her in the shallow water, catalogued the casual touches between them. Their first evening set the vacation's rhythm. Exhausted from travel and swimming, they ordered pizza and sprawled across the living room furniture, planning the week ahead. Blake positioned himself near Natalie on the sectional sofa, close but not touching, his contributions to conversation carefully calculated to align with her interests. "Remember that aquarium we talked about visiting?" he asked when excursions were discussed. "The one with the Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center." Natalie nodded stiffly, remembering the conversation from months ago when they'd first planned this trip, back when they were still together, when Blake had held her hand and described the place with such enthusiasm that she'd pictured them there together, a happy couple sharing an experience. The second day brought their first real conflict. As the group prepared for a morning at the beach, Blake approached Natalie with sunscreen. "I'll get your back," he offered, the bottle already open in his hand. "I'm good," Natalie replied, turning to Brooklyn instead. "Can you get the spots I missed?" The rejection hung in the air, small but significant. Blake's face darkened momentarily before he forced a smile and moved away. Throughout the day, he remained within Natalie's orbit, close enough to overhear her conversations, to monitor who she spoke with, to insert himself when opportunities arose. That evening, while most of the group went for ice cream, Blake cornered Natalie in the kitchen. "Are we ever going to talk about us?" he asked, blocking her path slightly. "About trying again?" "There's nothing to talk about," Natalie replied, her voice low but firm. We broke up, Blake. For good reasons. People make mistakes, he insisted, stepping closer. I've changed. This trip could be our fresh start. The conversation ended when Tyler and Jason returned early, but Blake's words lingered. We. Us. Our. His vocabulary revealed a relationship that only existed in his mind now. On their third day, the watershed moment came at dinner. Seated at a seafood restaurant overlooking the boardwalk, Natalie's phone buzzed repeatedly with texts. Each time she smiled at the screen, Blake's posture stiffened, his knuckles whitening around his fork. Someone's popular tonight, Brooklyn remarked, noticing Blake's reaction. Just Mike from my environmental science program, Natalie explained. He's doing an internship in Charleston this summer. The mention of an unknown male name transformed Blake's expression. What had been simmering jealousy crystallized into something harder, colder. Throughout dinner, his eyes rarely left Natalie's phone, tracking each notification with growing tension. When they returned to the house, most gathered for a movie, but Blake disappeared alone down the beach, his figure swallowed by darkness. From the balcony, Brooklyn and Natalie watched him go. I don't like this, Brooklyn whispered. The way he looked when you mentioned Mike. It's just texts from a classmate, Natalie sighed. I can't stop living my life because of how Blake might react. But that night, Natalie woke at 2 a.m. to find her bedroom door slightly ajar. Though she'd closed it before sleeping, she told herself it might have been the air conditioning. It wasn't until morning that she discovered her phone missing from the nightstand. After a frantic search, Tyler found it wedged between couch cushions, somewhere Natalie hadn't taken it. Checking her messages revealed the disturbing truth. Late-night texts to Mike that she hadn't sent, possessive words in her name. I should probably mention I'm seeing someone and maybe stop texting me so much. As she showed Brooklyn the messages, genuine fear flickered across Natalie's face. He went through my phone, she whispered. He's pretending to be me. That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered both literally and figuratively over their Myrtle Beach paradise, Blake approached Natalie on the beach with a peace offering, her favorite snacks arranged in a picnic basket, a tentative smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. The simple gesture carried unsettling undertones, evidence of how closely he still monitored her preferences, how desperately he clung to the relationship that existed only in his mind. As their friends frolicked in the waves, oblivious to the tension building between them, Blake leaned closer to Natalie. We need to talk about Mike, he said quietly. I don't think he's good for you. The wave of possessiveness in his words washed over Natalie like the incoming tide, gradual, persistent, and increasingly impossible to escape. The evening of June 5, 2023, settled over Myrtle Beach with a blanket of humid air that clung to skin like regret. Inside the beachfront rental, 12 friends were preparing for their night out at Surge, a local club known for its lenient ID policy and pulsing dance floor. Natalie Martin sat on the edge of a bed, massaging her temples as a headache built behind her eyes. You don't have to go if you're not feeling well, Brooklyn said, pausing her makeup application to study her friend with concern. Natalie winced as laughter erupted from downstairs. I think I need to skip it. This migraine is getting worse. When the group gathered in the living room, Natalie announced her decision to stay behind. Blake Linkis immediately volunteered to remain with her. I'll make sure she's okay, he insisted, ignoring Brooklyn's suspicious glare. I don't need a babysitter, Natalie protested weakly, but her pale complexion and pained expression undermined her independence. After a brief argument that Natalie lacked the energy to sustain, the arrangement was settled. The group departed in an explosion of perfume and excitement, leaving Blake and Natalie alone in the suddenly quiet house. You should lie down, Blake suggested, hovering as she made her way upstairs. Can I get you anything? Just need to sleep it off, Natalie mumbled, closing the bedroom door firmly between them. Once alone, she swallowed 2 pain relievers, changed into sleep shorts and a tank top, and texted Brooklyn, made it to bed. Door locked. Don't worry. The reply came quickly, keep your phone close. Text if you need anything. Natalie fell into fitful sleep, unaware that downstairs, Blake sat on the bottom step of the staircase, scrolling through old photos of their relationship. Each image deepened his conviction that they belonged together. Natalie in his varsity jacket at the homecoming game, both of them laughing in the snow during their ski trip, her head on his shoulder at prom. 2 years of memories that he couldn't accept were over. Around midnight, he heard her stirring. Moving silently up the stairs, he hesitated outside her door before gently testing the handle. Locked. Drawing a paperclip from his pocket, a trick learned from countless YouTube videos and practiced at home, he carefully manipulated the simple mechanism until it yielded. The room was dark except for moonlight filtering through thin curtains. Natalie lay on her side, chestnut hair spilling across the pillow, one arm outstretched toward her phone on the nightstand. Blake stood watching her breathe, his emotions cycling between adoration and resentment. When he sat on the edge of the bed, the movement woke her. Natalie's eyes flew open, confusion quickly turning to alarm. "Blake? What are you? How did you get in here?" "We need to talk," he said quietly. "About us. About our future." Natalie sat up, instantly alert despite her headache. "There is no us. No future. I've made that clear." "You don't mean that," Blake insisted, reaching for her hand. "We're perfect together. Everyone says so." Natalie pulled away, moving toward the far side of the bed. "I need you to leave. Now." "I saw the texts from Mike," Blake continued as if she hadn't spoken. "He doesn't know you like I do. 2 years, Natalie. 2 years of my life I've given you. Given me." Anger temporarily overrode her fear. "You don't own me, Blake. That's always been the problem." His expression hardened. "Is it Ryan? Are you seeing him now?" "This isn't about anyone else," Natalie said, reaching for her phone. "This is about you refusing to accept that I don't want to be with you." Blake moved faster than she expected, grabbing her wrist before she could take the phone. "You don't mean that. You can't mean that." Their struggle was brief but intense, Natalie pulling away, Blake tightening his grip, both of them speaking in heated whispers that gradually escalated to sharp words. "You're hurting me," Natalie hissed, trying to wrench her arm free. "I would never hurt you," Blake insisted, even as his fingers dug deeper. "I love you. I've always loved you." "This isn't love," Natalie shot back. "It's obsession. It's control. Let me go." With a sudden effort, she broke free and stumbled toward the door. Blake lunged after her, catching her shoulders and spinning her to face him. "You can't leave me," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Everyone leaves me. My mom left. You promised you wouldn't leave." That was before, Natalie countered, fear rising as she recognized the dangerous glint in his eyes. The same one she'd seen at Tyler's party in February. "Blake, you're scaring me." "I just want you to listen," he pleaded, backing her against the wall. "To understand how much I need you." What happened next occurred in a blur of motion and emotion. As Natalie attempted to push past him, Blake's hands found her throat. Whether to stop her or silence her, perhaps even he didn't know. His wrestler's grip, honed through years of training, closed with terrible efficiency. "I love you," he repeated, tears streaming down his face as her struggles weakened. "Why won't you love me back?" Natalie fought desperately, clawing at his hands, her feet kicking against the wall with thuds that went unnoticed in the empty house. Her eyes, wide with terror and incomprehension, locked with his as the pressure continued. It took less than 4 minutes for Natalie Martin to die. 4 minutes during which Blake Linkis transitioned from lovesick teenager to murderer, his obsession reaching its tragic, inevitable conclusion. When it was over, when Natalie lay still on the bedroom floor, Blake remained beside her until dawn, cradling her cooling body, whispering apologies and declarations of love that fell on deaf ears. As morning light filtered through the windows, illuminating the terrible reality he had created, Blake finally reached for the decorative letter opener on the dresser and plunged it into his own chest, a desperate, futile attempt to follow Natalie into darkness. But death rejected him, just as Natalie had. The morning of June 6, 2023, began like any other in the beach rental. Sunlight streamed through windows, distant waves crashed against the shore, and the scent of brewing coffee filled the kitchen where Tyler and Josh debated breakfast options. The peaceful scene shattered at precisely 9:07 a.m. when Blake Linkis stumbled down the stairs, his white t-shirt soaked crimson, screaming words that would haunt the group forever. "Natalie's not waking up. She's not waking up." His voice carried a raw desperation that froze everyone in place. Brooklyn, who had spent the night on the couch after finding the bedroom door locked, was the first to react. She bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, following the trail of blood droplets to the open bedroom door. The scene inside defied comprehension. Natalie lay on the floor beside the bed, her skin ashen, her tank top twisted, dark bruises encircling her throat like a macabre necklace. Brooklyn's scream brought the others running. "Call 911. Tyler shouted, dropping to his knees beside Natalie. Having completed a lifeguard certification the previous summer, he immediately checked for a pulse, finding none. He began chest compressions while Sophie, her hands shaking violently, fumbled with her phone. "She's already cold," Tyler said after a moment, his voice hollow with dawning horror. "She's been like this for hours." Megan pushed through the gathering crowd at the doorway, her first aid training from camp counseling kicking in. She tilted Natalie's head back to begin rescue breaths, but stopped short. "The lividity," she whispered, noting the purplish discoloration along Natalie's back where blood had settled. "And rigor, she's been dead since sometime last night." Blake stood in the corner, swaying slightly, blood seeping through his fingers where he pressed them against his chest. "I tried to save her," he mumbled, eyes unfocused. "I tried to join her." The wail of approaching sirens cut through the chaos. Jason and Drew restrained Blake when he attempted to return to Natalie's side, a brief struggle that ended with all three crashing into the dresser. By the time Horry County police officers entered the house at 9:23 a.m., the bedroom had become a tableau of grief and confusion, 11 teenagers in various states of shock, and one dead girl whose vacation had ended in unimaginable tragedy. The emergency medical technicians confirmed what the friends already knew. Natalie Martin had been deceased for approximately 8 to 10 hours. They turned their attention to Blake, whose self-inflicted wound proved superficial despite the dramatic blood loss. The letter opener had glanced off a rib, failing to penetrate deeply enough to damage vital organs. "What happened here?" Detective Alicia Ramirez asked, her experienced eyes taking in the scene methodically. 11 different voices tried to explain simultaneously until Tyler stepped forward, assuming the leadership role as he had throughout their friendship. He recounted the previous evening, Natalie's migraine, Blake staying behind with her, the group's late return from the club, the locked bedroom door. Detective Ramirez directed her officers to separate the witnesses. Brooklyn found herself in the kitchen with a female officer, her words tumbling out between sobs. "He was obsessed with her," she insisted. "They broke up months ago, but he wouldn't accept it. He stole her phone, pretended to be her in texts. He followed her everywhere." In the living room, Josh recounted the February incident at Tyler's party, while upstairs, crime scene technicians photographed the marks on Natalie's neck, the rumpled bedding, the blood drops leading to the bathroom where Blake had apparently stabbed himself hours after Natalie's death. For Blake, the questioning took place in an ambulance as paramedics treated his wound. Sedated and semi-coherent, he made statements that shifted between confession and denial. "She wouldn't listen," he mumbled. "I just wanted her to listen." By noon, the beach house had transformed into a fully processed crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the property, curious tourists gathered at the perimeter, and inside, forensic specialists collected samples, took measurements, and built the scientific narrative of Natalie Martin's final hours. The evidence told a clear story. The bruising pattern on Natalie's neck matched Blake's hands, the distinctive thumbprints on her trachea, finger marks wrapping around to the nape. Defensive wounds on her arms and hands showed she had fought desperately for her life. Most damning of all, skin samples under her fingernails provided DNA that would conclusively match her ex-boyfriend. At 2:17 p.m., as Natalie's body was removed from the house in a black zippered bag, Detective Ramirez formally placed Blake Linkis under arrest. Still wearing hospital scrubs after having his wound treated, Blake offered no resistance as officers secured his wrists with handcuffs. "Blake Linkis, "You are under arrest for the murder of Natalie Martin," Ramirez recited, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Blake stared back at the beach house, his expression unreadable. Inside, 11 teenagers huddled together in shocked grief. Their graduation celebration transformed into a waking nightmare. Brooklyn clutched Natalie's favorite scrunchie, found on the bathroom counter, a small, ordinary object now imbued with unbearable significance. Myrtle Beach continued its tourist rhythms around them. Children building sandcastles, couples strolling hand in hand, music drifting from beachfront bars. But for the friends of Natalie Martin, the world had stopped turning at 9:07 that morning, when their futures irrevocably split into before and after. The news of Natalie Martin's murder traveled the 500 miles from Myrtle Beach to Duncan Falls with devastating speed. By the evening of June 6, 2023, the small Ohio town found itself at the center of a tragedy that seemed impossible to comprehend. Yellow ribbons, Natalie's favorite color, began appearing on mailboxes and porch railings, a silent testament to collective grief. In the Horry County Detention Center, Blake Linkis sat alone in a holding cell, the gravity of his actions slowly penetrating the fog of shock and adrenaline. The jail-issued orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame, the elastic bandage visible beneath his collar where medical staff had treated his self-inflicted wound. His first visitor was not family but a court-appointed attorney who delivered the news that Blake's father was driving through the night to reach South Carolina. "The prosecution has already indicated they'll pursue the maximum charges," the attorney explained, taking in the blank expression of his teenage client. "First-degree murder with malice aforethought." Blake's voice, when he finally spoke, sounded foreign even to himself. "I didn't mean to hurt her." The attorney sighed, having heard similar protestations from countless defendants. "The preliminary evidence suggests manual strangulation, Blake. That's not a momentary lapse. It takes sustained pressure for several minutes." The clinical description sent Blake spiraling into his first true realization of what he had done. His wrestler's hands that had once caressed Natalie's face, played with her hair, intertwined with her fingers, had extinguished her life. He spent that night cycling between sobs that echoed through the detention center corridors and periods of catatonic stillness. In Myrtle Beach, the remaining 11 friends were relocated to a hotel by victim services while the beach house remained a sealed crime scene. They huddled together in adjoining rooms, shell-shocked and disbelieving. Their parents began arriving throughout the night, bleary-eyed from emergency flights and desperate drives, faces etched with the terror that comes from realizing how quickly children can be lost. Brooklyn sat cross-legged on a hotel bed, surrounded by Tyler, Sophie, and Ryan, recounting every warning sign she had noticed in Blake's behavior. Each memory now carried the terrible weight of hindsight. "I should have told someone when he stole her phone," Brooklyn whispered, her voice raw from crying. "I should have made her come home early." "This isn't on you," Tyler insisted, though his own eyes reflected similar guilt. "We all saw pieces of it. None of us put them together." In the adjacent room, detectives conducted follow-up interviews, piecing together a timeline that would eventually reveal the full horror of the night. Based on body temperature and lividity, the medical examiner estimated Natalie's death had occurred between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m. hours before the group discovered what had happened, hours during which Blake had remained with her body. Dawn broke over the Atlantic with cruel beauty as William Linkis arrived at the detention center, his face haggard from the overnight drive and the incomprehensible reality he now faced. The wrestling coach and construction worker who had raised his son alone since Blake's mother abandoned them now confronted a tragedy beyond imagining. His brief visit with Blake ended with both men in tears, bound by blood but separated by actions that could never be undone. Back in Duncan Falls, Susan from Little Sprouts Daycare placed a teddy bear on Natalie's empty chair, trying to explain to confused toddlers why their favorite teacher wouldn't return. Emma, the 3-year-old who had followed Natalie like a shadow, kept asking when she would come back, each question piercing Susan's heart anew. At Philo High School, hastily arranged grief counselors occupied the library, providing support to summer school students and staff struggling to process that 2 of their recent graduates, one dead, one accused of murder, had become national news. Principal Harrison gathered the faculty for an emergency meeting, their shared shock palpable as they prepared for the media onslaught that had already begun. "Remember, these were both our students," Harrison cautioned. "Both part of our community. We need to support Natalie's family while remembering Blake was also a troubled young man from our hallways." On June 8, 2 days after the discovery of Natalie's body, Blake Linkis appeared for his bond hearing at the Horry County Courthouse. He stood before Judge Eleanor Simmons in shackles, his father seated directly behind him. Across the courtroom, chairs reserved for Natalie's family remained empty. Her parents had requested their statement be read rather than attending in person, unable to face their daughter's killer. The prosecutor, Assistant Solicitor Marcus Jenkins, read their words to the hushed courtroom. He should never, ever be free again, let alone alive to taste and feel freedom after 3 weeks when he took our beautiful daughter from this world. Anyone who feels different should truly feel ashamed of themselves. The defense attorney argued for house arrest, citing Blake's age, lack of criminal history, and deep ties to his community. Judge Simmons considered the arguments before setting bond at $150,000, a decision that satisfied neither side. The defendant will surrender his passport, sign a waiver of extradition, and wear a GPS monitor at all times, she ordered. He is to have no contact with the victim's family or any witnesses to these events. As June turned to July, the physical distance between Myrtle Beach and Duncan Falls did nothing to separate the communities from shared trauma. The 11 friends who had witnessed the aftermath of Blake's actions returned to Ohio forever changed, carrying a collective burden that no teenager should bear. Brooklyn found herself unable to sleep, haunted by thoughts of what might have happened if she'd insisted on checking on Natalie earlier. Ryan Davidson, whose friendship with Natalie had triggered Blake's jealousy, withdrew from his college plans, deferring his admission to Ohio University where both Natalie and Blake had planned to attend. In the Davidson family's farmhouse on the outskirts of Duncan Falls, Natalie's Green Hunter's education certificate still hung on the wall beside her father's. Her mother couldn't bring herself to pack away the environmental science textbooks Natalie had highlighted for summer reading. Her bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to a life unfinished. William Linkis sold their house within a month, unable to face the community's mixed reactions of sympathy and condemnation. He and Blake relocated to his sister's home in Pennsylvania while awaiting trial, the GPS monitor a constant reminder of boundaries that could not be crossed. As summer faded into fall, 2 empty seats in Ohio University's freshman orientation stood as silent testimony to dreams derailed. In Duncan Falls, the yellow ribbons weathered and faded but remained in place. A community unwilling to forget, unable to understand, and forever marked by the tragic conclusion to what should have been a celebration of new beginnings. Autumn leaves fell on Natalie Martin's grave with quiet persistence throughout the fall of 2023. Her headstone, a simple granite marker with engraved wildflowers, became a pilgrimage site for Duncan Falls residents seeking to make sense of the senseless. Her parents, Michael and Diana Martin, visited daily at first, then weekly as grief settled into their bones like arthritis, chronic, painful, and ultimately incurable. At Little Sprouts Daycare, the children gradually stopped asking for Miss Natalie, their young minds adapting to her absence in ways their adult counterparts couldn't manage. Only Emma, now 4, continued placing artwork in a special folder she insisted was for when Natalie comes back. Susan, the director, couldn't bring herself to correct the child. The legal machinery of justice moved with excruciating slowness. Blake Linkis remained under house arrest at his aunt's Pennsylvania home, the GPS monitor around his ankle a constant reminder of boundaries he could no longer cross. His days consisted of online therapy sessions, meetings with his defense team, and long silences under his aunt's watchful, worried gaze. By Christmas, what had begun as a straightforward case grew increasingly complex. Forensic reports confirmed the cause of death as manual strangulation, with Natalie's DNA found beneath Blake's fingernails and his DNA on her neck and clothing. Yet the defense team began building a narrative of temporary insanity, citing Blake's history of possessive behavior and emotional instability as evidence of underlying mental health issues rather than calculated malice. Through summer and fall of 2024, both legal teams prepared their cases with meticulous attention. The prosecution built a narrative of escalating control and calculated murder, while the defense assembled expert witnesses to testify about adolescent brain development, trauma responses, and diminished capacity. The most significant challenge for the defense emerged in November 2024 when Judge Simmons ruled that Blake's statements to first responders would be admissible at trial. In the moments after discovery, as paramedics treated his self-inflicted wound, Blake had mumbled incriminating phrases, "She wouldn't listen and I just wanted her to listen." These 7 words, captured in EMT reports, undermined claims of unconscious action or temporary break from reality. For the Martin family, each legal development reopened wounds that never truly healed. Diana Martin resigned from her teaching position, unable to face classrooms that reminded her of the daughter who would never graduate college. Michael retreated to his hunting cabin for weeks at a time, his once gregarious personality replaced by brooding silence. Only their shared grief kept them tethered to each other and to the community that continued to rally around them. Brooklyn Farrell perhaps changed the most visibly. The once fashion-conscious, carefully styled teenager now pursued forensic psychology with single-minded determination. Her course selections and internships all focused on understanding the psychology of intimate partner violence. "I missed the signs once," she explained to her academic advisor. "I won't miss them again." As 2025 began, the Horry County Courthouse prepared for what would undoubtedly be its highest-profile case of the year. After multiple delays and procedural motions, Judge Simmons set the final trial date for February 10, 2025, nearly 2 years after Natalie Martin's life had ended on a beach trip meant to celebrate new beginnings. In the week before trial, Duncan Falls observed a somber quiet. The yellow ribbons, long since replaced with more durable versions, fluttered in winter winds. At Philo High School, the trophy case now included a small memorial plaque beside the wrestling team's conference championship photo, an uncomfortable juxtaposition of achievement and tragedy. William Linkis moved into a hotel near the courthouse, preparing to witness the legal system determine his son's fate. Blake, now 20 years old and noticeably thinner than the athlete who had once dominated wrestling meets, was transferred to Horry County Detention Center to await proceedings. The GPS monitor that had tracked his movements for 20 months was removed, replaced by institutional confinement. The Martin family made their own preparations for the emotional ordeal ahead. They selected clothes for court appearances, arranged for a support network of friends to accompany them, and met with victim advocates to understand the process. Diana meticulously framed her favorite photograph of Natalie, not her graduation portrait, but a candid shot from a camping trip, her daughter laughing beside a stream, wildflowers tucked behind her ear. "This is how I want the jury to see her," Diana explained. "Not just as a victim, as the person she was." As jury selection began on February 10, 2025, 2 young lives remained frozen in the public imagination. Natalie Martin, forever 18, her potential unrealized but immortalized in memory. Blake Linkis, physically grown but suspended in time, facing the possibility of decades behind bars for actions taken in minutes that could never be undone. The tragedy had expanded beyond individual families to encompass an entire community, forcing uncomfortable conversations about warning signs, intervention points, and collective responsibility. Parents in Duncan Falls now monitored their teenagers' relationships with heightened vigilance. Philo High School implemented mandatory education on healthy relationships and consent. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Natalie Martin's death was the gradual awakening of a small town to truths it had preferred to ignore, that violence doesn't always arrive as a stranger, that control masquerades as care, and that sometimes the greatest dangers come disguised as love.